Welcome to downtown London. As usual, this video is designed as an aid to exploration. Log off the computer, pull up this video on your phone, and go for a walk. Each time I'm done talking about a building, I'll throw up a map to get you to the next one. Pause the video and take a stroll. Indeed, feel free to wander off script for a while. I'll still be there when you get to the next site, and there's always another side street to explore. London, at least on paper, dates to 1793, when Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe visited the forks of the Thames and designated the site as the future capital of Upper Canada. The relocation of the capital, however, never happened, and it wasn't until the 1820s that the first settlers arrived in what is now downtown London. In 1826, the seat of the London district was formally relocated to the site, and the construction of a courthouse followed soon after. While it never became the capital of Canada, over the years, London has developed into an important regional centre. The arrival of the first railway, in 1853, transformed London into a regional transportation hub, while the growth of a major financial industry in the late 19th century allowed London to spread its influence across Canada. The downtown has steadily grown to the east over the course of its existence. In its earliest days, the intersection of Dundas and Ridout was the accepted centre of downtown London. By the late 19th century, the centre of the community had drifted east to Richmond Street, and in the 1920s, the growth of the Dundas and Wellington area almost shifted the centre of the city yet again. This walk roughly follows that trend, starting near the river and moving generally east to terminate in Victoria Park. The walk starts at the intersection of Dundas and Ridout Streets. On the southwest corner of Dundas and Ridout, you'll see the old Middlesex County Courthouse, the oldest building still standing in London. The courthouse was built in 1829, shortly after the seat of the London district was moved to the forks of the Thames. In 1829, Gothic architecture was still considered something of an oddity by most people, and the building is widely believed to have been designed in imitation of Malahide Castle, Colonel Thomas Talbot's boyhood home north of Dublin in Ireland. Talbot was the official responsible for the earliest European settlement in the London area, and a conservative man who saw himself as serving as a bulwark against pernicious American influences. The design of the building was almost certainly intended to reflect and reinforce British aristocratic influences. The building has been heavily altered since its construction. In 1846, a brick jail was added on the Thames River side of the building. Later, in 1878, the building was extended towards Ridout Street, replacing the original facade with a prominent tower, which dominates the intersection today. The building continued to see increasing usage as the population of the London area increased, and by the mid-20th century, talk of a replacement structure came to be unavoidable. Looking across the street, you'll see the new 1974 courthouse on the northeast corner of Dundas and Ridout. The building is an excellent brutalist structure, using concrete sculpturally from several different angles. At the time of its construction, the city's impulse was to tear the old courthouse down. The resultant fight led to one of London's first substantial heritage victories. Together, the two buildings represent London's best government architecture of two very different eras. Walk north a block, to the corner of Ridout and Queen's Avenue. You're looking for the row of three brick buildings stretching north from Queen's on the west side of Ridout. The buildings you're looking at are collectively known as the Ridout Street Restoration. The southernmost building, on the corner with Queen's, was built in 1838 as the home of London's first bank, and at one point in the 1840s this stretch of Ridout was known as Bankers' Row, with every bank in the city being located within a block of Ridout and Queen's. North of the Bank of Upper Canada, the middle building in the complex is the Anderson Block, built in 1842, and north of that again is the Anderson House, built in 1841. Both the two northern buildings were built for Dr. Alexander Anderson, one of London's most prominent early doctors, and the first man to use an anesthetic in the London area. By the 1960s, the buildings were falling into a state of substantial disrepair. After some agitation, they were purchased and restored by Labatt in 1967 to serve as offices, an early example of heritage restoration in London, and the inspiration for much later work. The next property to the north, situated behind a broad lawn, is Eldon House, built in 1834 as the home of John Harris. Harris was the treasurer of the London district, and as such was obligated to move to London when the new courthouse was established here. He erected his new house in 1834. Over the course of its history, the house has played host to visitors ranging from Canadian prime ministers to royalty. Today the building is the oldest surviving residence in London and has transformed into a museum. By now you've probably walked almost all the way north to Dufferin Avenue. Walk the last few addresses, and then turn right onto Dufferin. At Talbot Street you might want to walk a few doors south to see Camden Terrace, a row of 6 Victorian townhouses designed by Samuel Peters in 1876. Otherwise, or when you're done there, carry on along Dufferin Avenue to Richmond Street. You're looking for the Roman Catholic Cathedral on the intersection. St. Peter's Cathedral Basilica is the cathedral for the Roman Catholic Diocese of London. Built in 1885, the structure was designed by Joseph Connolly, star architect of the Roman Catholic Church in the late 19th century. Connolly was an Irish immigrant who established a practice in Toronto in the 1870s, beginning work with the Catholic Church by winning the commission for the spectacular Church of Our Lady Immaculate in Guelph. From that point forward, he continued to design many of the Catholic Church's most impressive structures in Ontario until his retirement in the 1890s. By the time Connolly came to design London's cathedral in 1880, he was very much at the peak of his abilities. The building is designed on a French Gothic model and ranks among the most attractive church buildings in southwestern Ontario. Construction of the building stretched over 5 years, with the structure being opened in 1885. Even then, the building wasn't complete, with the towers being postponed for financial reasons. They were finally added in 1958, using stone from the recently demolished post office in St. Thomas. St. Peter's is usually open for prayer during the day. The space is one of the finest in London, and well worth exploring. It's a deep, rich, solemn atmosphere. In particular, note the Stations of the Cross and the Paita and the Transept. Head south from St. Peter's along Richmond Street. You're looking for the modern facade of the Grand Theatre at 471 Richmond. The Grand Theatre was built in 1901 as a replacement for an earlier building destroyed by fire the previous year. Always possessed of a prosaic facade, the entire front end of the theatre was replaced during a 1971 reconstruction. Pass inside, however, and the original proscenium arch still dominates the stage. Across the street is the London Mutual Building, designed by George Craddock in 1889 for the London Mutual Fire Insurance Company. An ornate Victorian structure, the building is the last remnant of a financial centre, which developed on this stretch of Richmond Street in the 1880s and 90s. South of the London Mutual Building, dramatically terminating the east end of Fullerton Street, St. Paul's Anglican Cathedral is the oldest parish in London. For much of its history, the church was the heart of London's Anglophilic upper crust. Designed in 1846 by prominent Toronto architect William Thomas, this is also the oldest building in London to have been designed by a known architect. In the 1840s, the service of a trained architect was considered appropriate for large public buildings, but the general run of construction would make do with experienced builders building to traditional designs and rules of thumb. Even the courthouse at Dundas and Ridout wasn't formally designed by an architect. This building then was indicative of rising sophistication in the city. Its design was derived from a medieval English parish church, and its size was completely out of proportion to the actual size of the congregation it held at the time. The cathedral was dramatically expanded in 1892, at which point the transepts and chancel were added by Detroit architect Frederick Spear. If the cathedral is open, step inside. During the week, the space can often be accessed through the offices to the rear. The nave is one of the truly great spaces in London. Among other things, the church contains 4 stained glass windows by Tiffany Studios in New York City, the only Tiffany windows in southwestern Ontario, and the needlework in the chancel is vibrant and extensive. Before you leave, ask someone to point you to the St. Aidan's tapestries in the chapel. Across the street, on the west side of Richmond Street, between Queen's and Fullerton, is the Dominion Public Building. Designed by T.W. Fuller, head of the Department of Public Works in Ottawa, the building was built in 1936. The building was in large part undertaken as a public works project to provide employment during the Depression. One of the best Art Deco structures in the city, the building originally housed the post office on the ground floor and various federal offices in the tower. Carved into the second floor of the building, you'll see the symbols of the 4 founding nations, an old motif popular in the Montreal area at the turn of the century. From left to right are the shamrock of Ireland, the rose of England, the thistle of Scotland, and the fleur-de-lis of France, with the maple leaf of Canada inserted into the middle. The northeast corner of Richmond and Queen's, now part of the cathedral lawn, once held another major structure built more for political reasons than out of actual need. Following Canadian Confederation in 1867, the Government of Canada was eager to project an image of stability and unity in the new Dominion. One way that this was attempted was by undertaking an ambitious building program in cities across the new country. In most places, this building program involved new post offices, but London had recently erected a post office in 1860, and even political expediency couldn't justify the replacement of a structure which was only 7 years old. Accordingly, in 1873, London received a new custom house, designed by local architect William Robinson. In 1971, the building was demolished by the federal government, and the land it stood on donated to the Cathedral as public green space, a decision which has been seen as regrettable ever since. While the buildings we've looked at so far have been institutional in nature, it should be noted that Richmond and Queens was generally regarded as the centre of London's banking district by the 1880s, with every major financial institution in the city being located within a few blocks of the corner. Today only the London Mutual Building, which we noted earlier, survives from that era. Continue south to Dundas Street. Dundas and Richmond is generally taken as the centre of downtown London, and the intersection tends to be crowded and busy at any time of the day or night. Find a place to stand a little out of the way, and we'll discuss each of the corners of the intersection, starting with the northwest. The northwest corner of Dundas and Richmond is home to the Crystal Block, the oldest of the buildings on the intersection. Built in 1865 by the architect William Robinson, the building is a continuous block stretching north from Dundas to Carling Street. The building has been significantly abused through the years, but remains beautiful nonetheless. The building's original 8 niches, 6 of which remain to the present day, were originally intended to be filled with statues of significant Londoners. They have remained empty to the present day, but while the niches remain, the possibility remains with them. Across Dundas Street, on the southwest corner of Dundas and Richmond, is the former Smallman and Ingram department store. When the department store was built in 1908, the owners were unable to acquire the actual intersection, and as such built an L-shaped building surrounding it, with matching facades on both streets. It has since been renovated into an office complex, at which point the present tower was added. Across Richmond Street, on the southeast corner of Dundas and Richmond, is the Edge Block, an impressive Gothic edifice built in 1875 for William T. Edge. Designed by Samuel Peters, this is one of the only surviving downtown works of London's first architect, dating from the end of his career. Finally, across Dundas Street, on the northeast corner of Dundas and Richmond, is the third of 3 successive bank buildings on the site. In 1879, George Durand, then one of London's foremost architects, designed an elaborately ornate Second Empire Bank on the corner for the Federal Bank. The building dominated the intersection for a generation, until it was replaced in 1905 with a second bank, this one a classical edifice. The current structure was built in 1963. Before heading west from Dundas and Richmond, walk east along Dundas to see the fine high Victorian facade of Scanderett's Grocery at 175 Dundas. Designed by George Durand in 1883. When built, the facade was topped by further ornamentation, culminating in an urn perched 4 stories above Dundas Street. Head west along Dundas a few addresses. You're looking for the Art Deco facade at 130 Dundas Street. The last of several stores on the site, Kingsmill's was founded by Thomas Kingsmill, an Irish dry goods merchant who moved to London in 1865. The current building is notable as one of only a handful of excellent Art Deco facades in central London, and was designed by Oliver Roy Moore after a 1932 fire destroyed the previous Kingsmill store on the site. Turn south. On the south side of Dundas, just to the east of Fanshawe's downtown campus, you'll see Market Lane, which will take you through to Covent Garden Market. When you hit the market, turn right and walk into the plaza in front. London's original market site was located in front of the courthouse at Ridout and Dundas Streets. In 1844, however, the town relocated the market to the block bounded by Wellington, York, Waterloo, and Bathurst Streets, a plot just to the east of what is now downtown London, and at the time well outside of town. The new location was generally considered too remote, and merchants on the south side of Dundas began hosting a bazaar on the rear portion of their lots. For a time, London had 2 markets, but public usage massively favored the downtown site, and eventually the city acquiesced in the location. Samuel Peters was commissioned to design a new market building, completed in 1854. The building survived into the 1950s, when it was replaced with a combined market and parking garage. The 1956 market was itself replaced with a new market building in 1999. By the middle of the 20th century, The stretch of Talbot Street opposite the Covent Garden Market was occupied by a continual block of 19th century buildings culminating in the Talbot Inn on the intersection of Dundas and Talbot, one of the city's finest hotels in the late 19th century. Over the late 1980s, however, Cambridge developments began buying up the entire block of the city, bounded by Dundas, Talbot, King, and Ridout, with the intention of erecting a mall on the site. A protracted preservation campaign followed, culminating in one of the city's most photogenic demonstrations, when over 1,000 joined hands around the threatened block. Nevertheless, in 1991 the block was demolished, leaving a hole in the cityscape which has yet to be properly filled, arguably London's biggest heritage tragedy. An image of the Talbot block has been carved into the monument on the site, along with a stained glass window on the second floor of the Covent Garden Market. To your south, the stretch of King Street near the Covent Garden Market was known in the late 19th century as Whiskey Row, a notorious area of drunks, prostitutes, and regular bar fights. The only surviving building from the era is the former Bank Hotel on the southeast corner of Talbot and King. From Covent Garden, head east along King Street. Stop at the intersection of King and Richmond Streets. The northwest corner of Richmond and King, where the Royal Bank stands today, is the site of the Masonic Temple and Opera House, built in 1881. Designed by London architect George Durand, the building was one of the best Second Empire buildings in the London area, and arguably the absolute best. By the end of the 1870s, London's masons had been making do with temporary and makeshift accommodations for decades, and felt that a permanent structure was in order. The building featured an elaborate roofline, and the entire western section of the building was given over to a massive new theatre. Ornamental sculptures on Richmond Street featured artists from William Shakespeare to Christopher Wren. The hall was one of London's foremost musical venues for decades, but was gutted in a fire in 1900. The structure was rebuilt, but was a mere remnant of its former self. It was demolished in 1968. On the northeast corner of Richmond and King is the Richmond Hotel, a fine Italianate building constructed in 1860. The Richmond is the oldest surviving hotel in London, and continues to serve as a hotel and bar to the present day. Across King Street, on the southeast corner of Richmond and King, is the Imperial Bank Building. Built in 1907 for the Imperial Bank of Canada, the structure is the only London work of Neil Derrick, an important architect from St. Thomas, a regional centre 30 kilometres south of London. Walk south a block to the corner of Richmond and York. The block you're walking along is one of the finest in downtown London. Look up at the facades on both sides of the street. The London and Western Trusts building, on the west side of the street, was built in 1921 and retains its original banking hall. Looking east down York Street, you'll see London's present-day railway station. The Great Western Railway, London's first railway, arrived in the city in 1853, and trains have been stopping in more or less the same location ever since. The first station on the site was a temporary wooden building, replaced by an Italianate station in 1857, by which point the Great Western had been extended to Windsor. The 1857 station rapidly became inadequate, and the idea of replacing it with a larger structure was raised repeatedly through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Several reports pointed to the structure's limitations, but for over 50 years only temporary solutions were taken, during which time railway technology changed radically, and the lines went through not one but two corporate mergers, becoming first the Grand Trunk and later the Canadian National Railway. Finally, in 1936, the old station was replaced by a spacious Art Deco structure designed by John Schofield, chief architect of the Canadian National Railway. The 1936 building came to serve regular trains to Chicago and Montreal, along with almost every major city in southwestern Ontario. The building was demolished in 1962, and the present building is the latest in a string of short-lived replacements. Across the tracks from the Great Western's railway station was the station of the London and Port Stanley Railway. Built in 1856, the tracks of the London and Port Stanley stretched south towards St. Thomas and the lake at Port Stanley. Over the course of its history, it served to connect London to the lake, both for industrial and recreational purposes. Its ownership, however, changed several times. In 1887, during the railway's period as a branch line of the Michigan Central Railway, the railway hired Detroit architect Frederick Spear to design a new station for London. The building was an elaborate Victorian structure, which survived until its demolition in 1937. In the early 20th century, Sir Adam Beck, the man responsible for harnessing Niagara Falls for electrical power, was encouraging the growth of a series of electrical railways across Ontario. Small electric railways came to exist in the Windsor, Chatham, Woodstock, and Hamilton areas, but with the ownership of the London and Port Stanley having defaulted once again to the City of London, Beck saw an opportunity to demonstrate the potential behind electric railways on a much larger scale. Electrification was completed in 1914, and 2 generations of London came to associate it with a trip to the beach in Port Stanley. Passenger service ended on the line in 1957. The proximity of the railway station made the intersection of Richmond and York a prime location for hotels. The southwest corner is the former site of the Tecumseh House, designed by London architect Samuel Peters. When it was opened in 1858, the Tecumseh was the largest hotel in British North America, and it remained the city's social hub for well over a quarter century. The guest list of the Tecumseh reads like a who's who of late 19th century, including among themselves John Franklin's widow, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and Dom Pedro II, Emperor of Brazil. Dom Pedro stayed here for a night during a tour of North America in 1876. He was traveling incognito, but was recognized and given a spontaneous tour of the city. The Tecumseh was eventually surpassed by newer, more spacious hotels, and ultimately rendered unprofitable by Prohibition. The city purchased and demolished the building during the construction of the Richmond Street underpass in 1930. On the northeast corner of Richmond and York is the Grieg House, the Tecumseh's principal competitor during its heyday. Built in 1879, the Grieg House was the first hotel in London to be built with running water, and its restaurant was widely renowned, but it never managed to surpass the Tecumseh in importance. Return north to the intersection of Richmond and King, and turn right. You're looking for the Second Empire building, at 183 King Street. Built in 1890, the Fraser House is arguably London's finest surviving Second Empire building. Originally a hotel and bar, the building fell victim to the rising temperance movement seeking to restrict the sale of alcohol. Indeed, by the turn of the century, the building was being occupied by the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and at one point was home to the city's YMCA. Continue east along King Street to Clarence Street, then turn left and walk a block north to Dundas. The tall office building, on the northeast corner of Dundas and Clarence, was built in 1931 as the new head offices of the Huron and Erie Mortgage Corporation. It is among the city's finest Art Deco structures, with stylized carvings of Canadian industrial workers above its second-story windows. Designed by the London architectural firm of Watt and Blackwell, the banking hall is worth stepping into if you're passing by during banking hours. 2 doors east of the Huron and Erie building is the Ontario Furniture Building, built in 1909 as a furniture store. The large bay windows fronting onto Dundas were originally used to display the company's wares to passers-by and draw heavily on contemporary architectural trends in Chicago. Across from the Ontario Furniture Building, you'll see the restored facade of the Mechanics Institute. Mechanics Institutes were important mid-19th century institutions, providing lectures, evening classes, and access to extensive libraries to the working class for relatively nominal fees. London's Institute dated to 1835, when a structure was built near the old courthouse. A generation and a half later, in 1877, the firm of Robinson and Tracy was commissioned to design a new building. When it opened, the Mechanics Institute had become such a significant institution that the railways had to schedule special trains for people wanting to join the festivities. The Mechanics Institute closed its doors in 1895, its library being used as the nucleus of the newly created public library system. Immediately to the east of the Mechanics Institute is the current central branch of the public library, opened to the public in 2002. The Central Library, in turn, is just west of the intersection of Dundas and Wellington. At one point in the early 20th century, it seemed as though the center of downtown might shift east from Dundas and Richmond to Dundas and Wellington. The most dramatic element of this shift was going to be the creation of Federal Square on the southeast corner of the intersection. Beginning in 1912, when the plans were announced, the city systematically acquired land in the block bounded by Wellington, King, Waterloo, and Dundas. Renderings pictured a large, paved square bordered by neoclassical buildings with a new city hall on the north side of Dundas. A city beautiful project, in many ways typical of its era, Federal Square was likely more ambitious than the city could have accomplished. It fizzled out gradually, however, delayed indefinitely by the First World War. The city sold off the assembled land without fanfare. What did wind up appearing on the southeast corner was the Hotel in London, built there in 1927. Designed by Oliver Roy Moore, Hotel London was to the London of the 1940s and 50s what the Tecumseh House had been to the London a century earlier. The building was the city's primary social centre, and the residence of choice for visiting dignitaries from abroad. It was demolished in 1972, and the site is now occupied by two large office towers. Across the street, on the southwest corner of Dundas and Wellington, is the former home of the Bank of Toronto, designed by the London architectural firm of Watt and Blackwell in 1928. On the northeast corner of Dundas and Wellington is London's old City Hall, built in 1928. When the city sold its previous City Hall in 1911, it had only the vaguest of plans for a replacement structure, and after several years in temporary quarters, the need for a proper City Hall had become obvious to everyone. Everyone in the city had different ideas as to where the new City Hall should be located, however, and for years no solid plan gained widespread approval. Impatient with the delay, and desperately needing new quarters, the Public Utility Commission built a new building at Dundas and Wellington in 1911, while the rest of the city offices continued to be caught up in politics and delays. Finally, in 1928, a compromise position was adopted, whereby the Public Utilities Commission's offices were expanded to the east. The building masquerades as symmetrical, but in fact it continues to clearly show its two-stage history. The 6 bays of windows on the left are the old PUC building, while the 8 bays of windows on the right were built as the new City Hall. The ground floor treatments of the old and new buildings are also different. The building served as the City Hall until 1971. By this point you should have wandered down a block from Clarence to Wellington. If you're interested, you could walk another block east to look at the 1905 London Armouries, now a hotel. Otherwise, or when you're done, turn north on Wellington Street. The right building, immediately behind the old City Hall, was built in 1902 and features an excellent Beaux Arts facade. Stop at the intersection of Wellington and Queen's Avenue. The southwest corner of Wellington and Queen's was the site of London's first public library branch, designed in 1895 by Herbert Edward Matthews. A result of new library legislation passed by the province, the nucleus of the collection was formed when the city acquired the library of the Mechanics' Institute. The building remained the central library until 1940. Immediately to the south of the library building was the YMCA, built in 1897 and designed by the firm of Moore and Henry. The YMCA eventually expanded to include the library building to the north, when a new central library was built in 1940. The complex, however, was destroyed in a spectacular January fire in 1981. Londoners of a certain age will still remember the ruins of the Y in the morning, covered with icicles from the firefighters' hoses and looking like a particularly magnificent ice palace. Today, the site of both buildings is occupied by One London Place, originally built as the 1993 expansion of the offices of London Life. Across the street, on the northwest corner of Wellington and Queen's, is the company's 1964 expansion. We'll talk more about London Life later, but both of those buildings are worth noting as excellent examples of office architecture of their respective eras. Head east on Queen's Avenue. The apartment buildings on either side of you date to the late 19th century, and are some of the oldest such buildings in the city. Find the Art Deco former library at 305 Queen's Avenue. The Elsie Perrin Williams Memorial Library was built with money from Elsie Perrin Williams' will. That wasn't, however, Elsie's intent. On her death during the depths of the Great Depression, the woman had left the city her estate north of the city, and several $1 million with the instructions that the money was to be used to transform her estate into an art gallery. At the time, however, her residence was miles from the built-up area, and concerns were raised that an art gallery at such an inaccessible location would get little use. At the same time, the city was in desperate need of both a significant expansion to the public hospital and a new central library branch. After extended legal battles, therefore, an Act of Parliament was passed to break Elsie Perrin Williams' will. The new library, built in 1940 by architect Leonard Bridgman, was the result. It remained the city's central library branch until 2002. Turn around and walk up Picton Street to Dufferin Avenue. Turn left at Dufferin and walk a block west to the intersection of Wellington and Dufferin. On the northeast corner of Wellington and Dufferin is London's City Hall, an excellent example of modern architecture designed in 1971 by Philip Carter Johnson. No one following its construction is the cheese grater. The building was extremely controversial at the time of its construction. Prior, the east side of Victoria Park had consisted of a series of large Victorian residences, and the intrusion of institutional buildings so far into a hitherto residential neighbourhood was broadly resented, especially given that early plans for the new City Hall had located at the forks of the Thames, on a site later used for the erection of Museum London. In recent years, the City Hall has sparked a revival of interest in mid-20th century architecture in London, and is beginning to be recognised as the modern masterpiece that it is. On the southeast corner of Wellington and Dufferin is Metropolitan United Church. When the Queen's Avenue Methodist Church burnt in a fire in 1895, the prominent Toronto architectural firm of Burke and Horwood was commissioned to design a replacement. When built, the new building was the largest Methodist church in Canada west of Montreal. It features spectacular ornamental brickwork, and the sanctuary is a truly beautiful space, worth stepping into if you have the opportunity. In 1925, the church became Metropolitan United, with the Union of Canada's Methodist and Congregationalists, and many of the country's Presbyterians. It remains one of the city's most active congregations today. On the southeast corner of Wellington and Dufferin is the London Life Building, built in 1927 as the head offices of the London Life Insurance Company, one of the largest financial institutions in London. At the time, the selection of location was controversial. Until the construction of London Life, Victoria Park had featured a perimeter composed entirely of residences and churches. The new head offices were the first commercial structure on the park, and much as in the case of City Hall 4 decades later, the intrusion was unwelcome. Construction, however, proceeded under the direction of John Mackenzie More, one of London's most prominent architects of the era. The resultant building is perhaps the finest example of classical commercial architecture in southwestern Ontario, consisting of a rhythmic series of columns marking out the southern limit of Victoria Park, punctuated by a central grand entrance. Looking back along Wellington Street, you'll see 3 generations of London Life expansions, showcasing the best in office architecture from the 1920s, the 1960s, and the 1990s. Together they make an excellent collection. On the northwest corner of Wellington and Dufferin, and at the end of our walk, is Victoria Park, arguably the best used park in the city. Victoria Park has its origins in the barracks of the British garrison in London, established here in 1835. While the military was the principal occupant of the site, other uses were found through the years. The annual Western Fair happened on the site, and Canada's first integrated school was located in an outbuilding here. The school had been established to educate the children of fugitive slaves, but the quality of education was sufficiently good that local white families asked if their children could attend as well. In 1886, the military left, and the land was transformed into a public park. Victoria Park is an incredibly relaxing place for a stroll or a picnic. From a historic perspective, the park is filled with monuments, featuring the cenotaph at Wellington and Dufferin, a monument to the Boer War, cannons used during the siege of Sebastopol in the Crimean War, the Holy Roller, a tank which saw active service in the Second World War, and a number of plaques. Socially, this is one of the city's great public spaces, playing host every summer to festivals and dog walkers alike. You're finished with our walk. From here you could head back to Dundas and Ridout by walking 2 blocks south on Wellington and 4 blocks west on Dundas. Alternatively, you could wander east into the Victorian residential streets of Woodfield, or you could spend the day in Victoria Park, which may be the most enjoyable option of all.